There is a silence that some men can survive, and there is a silence that finds the one crack in them nobody else could reach. For Don Rickles, that silence had a name. He had spent 7 decades proving that no one was untouchable. He looked Frank Sinatra in the eye and dared him to throw a punch. He'd made a sitting president flinch and laugh in the same breath. He'd reduced Johnny Carson to tears of helpless laughter on national television, night after night, like it was nothing. Rickles didn't ask permission to be feared. He simply walked into a room, found the softest spot and the toughest man alive, and pressed until the whole place came apart laughing. That was his gift. That was his religion. And then there was the man who never laughed at all. No smirk, no wince, no flicker of amusement crossing that composed, unreadable face. Rickles would fire his sharpest line, the one that had leveled rooms for 50 years, and would simply land on nothing, absorbed, unanswered, gone. For a man who measured his own existence in the sound of people cracking open with laughter, that kind of silence wasn't just awkward, it was unbearable. It followed him. It needled at something under the jokes, something he rarely let anyone see. His name was Denzel Washington. And somewhere along the way, he became the one door Don Rickles could never kick open. To understand why that mattered so much, you have to understand who Rickles was before the world knew him as Mr. Warmth, the most affectionate insult ever hurled at a man who made a career out of cruelty that somehow never felt cruel. He was born Donald J. Rickles in 1926 in a modest household in Jackson Heights, Queens, the only child of an insurance man, and a mother who saw something in her son's restless mouth long before anyone else did. He was a kid who couldn't sit still in a classroom without cracking wise, who discovered early that a sharp enough joke could turn a room of strangers into something like a family, if only for a moment. He wanted Broadway. He wanted Shakespeare. He enrolled in dramatic art school in New York with dreams of being taken seriously, and the universe, with a particular sense of humor, handed him something else entirely. It happened almost by accident, on some forgettable stage, during some forgettable play, when Rickles filled a dead pause with an unscripted little jab, and the audience laughed harder at that single throwaway line than at anything the script had given him all night. He noticed. He couldn't stop noticing. World War II pulled him away for a few years, out onto the Pacific aboard a Navy vessel, where he learned that a joke told at the right moment could make frightened young men forget, for just a second, how frightened they were. He came home from the war with that lesson stitched into him permanently. Laughter wasn't decoration. It was survival. It was connection when nothing else was available. Back in New York, with acting work nowhere to be found, he took to the nightclub circuit, and one night, heckled by a stranger who wanted to rise out at him, Rickles gave it back twice as hard, and the room exploded. Not with outrage, with joy. He'd found it. Not the polished performer he thought he wanted to be, but something rawer, something the stage had never quite seen before, a man who could walk out, look at total strangers, and tear them apart with such precision and warmth that they left feel like they'd been let in on something rather than torn down. By the early 50s, insult comedy barely existed as a genre, and Rickles built it almost single-handedly. No setups, no careful punchlines, just a walk to center stage, a scan of the room, and then straight for whatever vulnerability was closest. Haircuts, marriages, egos. Nobody left unscathed, and somehow, nobody left resentful either. That contradiction became his signature, brutal enough to sting, gentle enough underneath that people walked away feeling chosen rather than humiliated. Somebody, somewhere, gave the act its lasting nickname, Mr. Warmth, dripping with irony, and it stuck for the rest of his life. But nightclubs were one thing. Hollywood was a different mountain, and it took one perfectly reckless night to hand him the summit. Frank Sinatra walked into a Miami club expecting a show. Rickles looked straight at him, at the most powerful and most feared man in American entertainment, and cracked a line that should have ended a lesser comedian's career on the spot. Something about Sinatra making himself at home and hitting somebody, the way only a man in his own house might. The room froze for one long, terrifying beat. Then Sinatra threw his head back and roared. That was the door swinging open. Sinatra didn't just laugh. He adopted him, dragged him into rooms he'd never have entered otherwise, vouched for him to the people who mattered, turned abrasive into essential with a single word of approval. Soon Rickles was a fixture on Johnny Carson's couch, thriving in the one format built entirely on control, by refusing to be controlled, mocking the host, roasting the band, needling the audience at home, and somehow making chaos itself into appointment television. The Dean Martin roast turned him into something like Hollywood's designated equalizer, the one man who could put Ronald Reagan, Bob Hope, movie stars, and mob-adjacent legends alike in their place, and have them thank him for it afterward. To be roasted by Rickles wasn't humiliation. It was membership. It meant you belonged. He chased the acting dream, too, and got real footing in it. Sharing scenes with Clark Gable, trading barbs with Clint Eastwood, eventually anchoring his own sitcom as a barking Navy officer that let him growl at somebody for a living outside the clubs. But it was never really about the credits. It was about the exchange. The insult was only ever half the joke. The other half was a look on someone's face when they realized they'd been included rather than attacked. That was the machine Denzel Washington broke. Because Washington wasn't playing a different game. He simply wasn't playing at all. He carried himself with the same unshaken composure on a red carpet as he did commanding a film set, dignified, private, entirely closed the performance. Where Sinatra had leaned in and Carson had folded over laughing, and even the sitting president had grinned through gritted teeth, Washington gave Rickles nothing. Not hostility, not offense, just a still, unreadable calm that no barb seemed able to touch. Insiders say Rickles tried, more than once, in green rooms and at galas, and in those brief accidental crossings that Hollywood specializes in. He'd throw something sharp, a crack about granite monuments having more motion in their face, and wait for the crack in the armor that always came, eventually, from everyone else. It never came, and the longer it didn't come, the more the joke stopped feeling like a joke to him and started feeling like something closer to a verdict. Because here's the thing almost no one understood about Don Rickles. The insult was never the point. The laugh was. Every barb he'd ever thrown was a kind of handshake in disguise, an invitation into a private language only two people could speak once the joke landed. The teller and the target, bonded for a moment by the same understanding. When Washington refused to laugh, Rickles wasn't just missing a punchline. He was being told, without a single unkind word, that the invitation wasn't going to be accepted. For a man who had spent his entire life turning strangers into intimates through laughter, that silence didn't read as indifference. It read as rejection, and rejection cut in a place none of his other targets had ever managed to reach. Friends noticed a shift whenever Washington's name came up in later years. The usual affectionate, needling Rickles reserved even for his harshest critics sharpened into something flatter, something with less of the wink behind it. It wasn't hatred in the way the headlines like to frame it. It was something quieter and more human than that. The frustration of a man who had built an entire identity around being able to reach anyone, discovering that one person, through no cruelty of his own, simply couldn't be reached that way. Washington had never set out to deny him anything. He was only ever being himself. But to Rickles, that composed silence felt like the one door in Hollywood that refused, gently and permanently, to open. It became, by his own account, the single asterisk on an otherwise flawless record, the one laugh he chased for years and never got a claim. And yet, that unresolved thread was never the whole story of the man. Away from the stage, Rickles was almost unrecognizable from his public self. He married Barbara Sklar in 1965, a woman who, fittingly, hadn't laughed at his jokes the first time they met, and something about her immunity to his charm was exactly what drew him in. Their marriage lasted 56 years, an almost unheard of number in an industry built to devour relationships, and by every account it stayed genuinely tender the whole way through. He raised 2 children with her, doted on grandchildren who knew him not as the razor-tongued legend of the Sinatra years, but simply as Grandpa Don, and delightfully as a voice inside a small plastic Pixar potato that outlived every roast he ever delivered. He used to joke that 50 years of work would be remembered because of a talking spud. Secretly, it thrilled him. Proof that his voice had crossed into a generation that had never even heard of Sinatra. Loss found him, too, the way it finds everyone eventually. In 2011, his son Larry died suddenly at just 41, and something in Rickles that had always had a joke ready simply didn't, not for a long while. Those who interviewed him afterward noticed the wit still there, but thinner now, weighted by something no comeback line could fix. A decade later, Barbara passed as well, on the very anniversary of the day they married. The timing felt almost too cruel to be real, and yet it closed their story with strange, aching symmetry. 56 years beginning and ending on the same date. He died in 2017 at 90, in the home he'd shared with a woman who'd never laughed at his first joke and loved him for 56 years afterward. The tributes came from everywhere. Comedians, actors, politicians, the very people he'd spent a lifetime tearing gently apart. Almost none of them mentioned Denzel Washington. They didn't need to. What they remembered instead was a man who had turned insult into intimacy, who would figure out, decades before anyone else dared try, that the sharpest thing you could say to someone might also be the kindest, if you said it right. The one man who never laughed was never really the story. He was only ever proof of it. Proof that behind every joke Rickles ever told was a man desperately, humanly hoping to be let in. Most of the time, the world let him in. And the one time it didn't, it revealed more about his heart than 1,000 roasts ever could.